All right, in order to discuss how Stalin rose to power, we first need to look at the factors that were in place that allowed for his takeover. Like Hitler, Stalin had a few things going for him economically and socially. Throughout this unit, we're going to be asking the same questions that we asked about Hitler, but because it's a communist state instead of a fascist one, the order is going to look a little bit different. So, how did Stalin rise to power, and what circumstances were pre-existing that laid the framework for Russia's collusion with evil? What was communism's role in the founding of the USSR, and what was his opposition? While Hitler removed his opposition after rising and consolidating his power through the Night of Long Knives, Stalin removes opposition and creates a bureaucratic confusion in order to legitimize his control over the Soviet state in the first place. You should have already watched the 13-minute video on the Russian Revolution. The link is there. Good luck reading it with all that read. Chapter 18 in your Palmer textbook does a really good job laying out the groundwork on pages 719 to 742. I'm not requiring that you read those pages, but if you do have any questions, they're pretty helpful and available. In short, Tsar Nicholas was a ruthless and ignorant leader. He cared for his family very much, but not the plight of his overgrown nation. World War I allowed for the communist coup because Russians felt that they were fighting a war without purpose, and they blamed their suffering on the monarchy. Once a new government was established, the European powers tried to intervene on behalf of the white capitalist supporters in Russia. But the Red Army during the Russian Civil War was too strong, and they ended up victorious. Lenin was able to consolidate power through violence and a singular belief in a predestined future. He saw himself as a godlike figure that would take the Communist Manifesto and push it into real action. The communist government was originally divided between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks. Mensheviks were the true Marxists in that they thought a continual revolution was necessary, but that once the revolution was achieved, it could only be maintained through a total sharing of power by all citizens of the state. Therefore, the educated and uneducated would share equally in the workings of government. The Bolsheviks, which is whom Lenin sided with, believed that the uneducated masses were dumb, and while useful for a violent revolution, they were worthless when it came to governing. This established a communist hierarchy, which, yes, I know that that's an oxymoron. Therefore, when Lenin took power, he allowed no opposition, crushing enemy Mensheviks and critics, which left the tradition of authoritarianism and terror. Oh, and that picture from left to right there? Stalin, Lenin, Trotsky. If they only knew what was about to unfold. Lenin established the Bolshevik government that was sort of modeled off of a federalist democracy, but it was so convoluted with bureaucracy that he was able to retain total decision-making powers. There was the Council of People's Commissars, the Secretariat, and Politburo. Each branch had its own hierarchy, but remained subservient to central obedience. The council was kind of like an executive branch, but here's their definition of the council's purpose. In the Constitution of the Soviet Union of 1924, the Council of People Commissars of the Soviet Union was defined as the executive and administrative body of the Central Executive Committee of the Soviet Union, and with the adoption of the Constitution of the Soviet Union in 1936, it received an alternate name, the Government of the Soviet Union. We can see what you're doing, Lenin. You had a word count requirement to that Constitution essay, didn't you? We too know how to use a thesaurus. So what's the difference between authoritarianism and the absolutism of a monarch? Mainly the cult of personality that the authoritarian leader creates. Otherwise, they're really similar. There's a one-party state, which outlaws all competition through the establishment of a police state, and establishes the leadership as the new religious head of government, therefore outlawing all religious practices. But these policies had to be watched closely, and therefore the removal of the opposition in the USSR was left to the police state, the Cheka, or the OGPU, NKVD, and later the KGB, which it changes its names often and creates a lot of confusion so that you don't really know who's watching you. They established a ban on free speech, destruction of unions, which is honestly hilarious because demanding workers' rights was really the original tenet of socialism. And finally, Lenin started the Lenin Enrollment to increase numbers of workers for the Communist Party. Think of that as a club pledge of sorts. Lenin calls his structure of government war communism, with a focus on a cultural revolution intended to mold Russians into a new and better species. Species, yes. Now, this language is really important because we're borrowing other ideas here to compare and contrast to other parts of the world. Remember, this is the same time of white man's burden and social Darwinism, but how it is put into action is going to look a little bit different in a communist state. Russia's #1 resource is its large population. And while it has an expansive landmass that doesn't do much for economic production because half of it is tundra and desert, throughout the early 20th century, the theme of nationalism reigned supreme. And while all countries throughout the world closed their borders with protectionist policies after World War I, the USSR slaps a little communist twist on their protection. They create a Comintern, which is an economic program that promises trade, but only with like-minded individuals, fellow commies. Now, I know that this comes as a huge surprise and all, but communism doesn't work. War communism is also insane. Lenin placed all agricultural production under a central control of the Politburo in order to revive itself from war efforts of the previous decade. So agriculture and industry were placed under central control while the government began seizing grain stocks and peasants, and he prohibited farming for profit. While people had no incentive to farm because they were starving to death, even though they grew all the food all day long, the economy started to fracture. And Lenin missed the part about supply and demand and incentive chains when he was a law student at Kazan University. But honestly, it makes sense he missed that lesson because he was expelled only 3 months in, while somehow he still earned his law degree in 1891. I don't know. When Lenin sees he is killing off his population and they're prone to riot at any moment, he reintroduces a market economy, which Lenin saw as a backwards ideal of Bolshevism. He goes back on his idea that hurting the peasant was supposed to encourage the revolution, and sees without peasants he has no revolution at all. So that new economic policy of 1921 was supposed to be a short-term solution and revoked quickly, but it was still in place when Lenin died. People need to eat, surprising, and have an incentive to work if they're going to continue working and supporting their government. See, Lenin, you're getting it. Why would the curtains just kill me? In 1924, Lenin dies. His body is embalmed in Moscow, and to this day, in case you want to visit him and have a conversation about market economics. But seriously, not to belabor the point. Almost $200,000 per year to keep him looking this good, practically alive. That really is him in there, looking like a candle. Speaking of vacuum packed, when Lenin dies, it creates a power vacuum. I hope you're paying attention to trends at this point because every authoritarian rise begins with a power vacuum. Lenin was only 53 and he left no plans for the government after his death. Stalin, though, being the astute, mustached, crazy opponent already holding positions of power within the People's Commissar, and he was the lead of the Communist Party, makes sense that he would step in. He was primed for this position. There's only one problem, though. He wasn't very likable. Actually, he was scary. Trotsky was the logical choice to follow Lenin, as he was most closely aligned in his policies politically and economically. He was a war revolutionary, but he wasn't fully liked or trusted in party politics. He also was honestly a bit of a pushover, especially when it came to Stalin. Again, Stalin had a murderous stare, and he was a bully. Trotsky knew Stalin had it out for him. So, Trotsky didn't attend Lenin's funeral. That doesn't seem like an issue, but with a crazy propaganda artist like Stalin at the helm, it was an issue. Now, while there was not an exact plan of how the transition of power would take place or what communism would look like under the new leadership, Lenin supposedly dictated a testament before he died to Trotsky. Yeah, exactly. Trust your resources, my people. Hang on, because this does get good. Now, also pay attention real quick to the word choice here, because testament can be a word used for biblical or legal standings. And that is intentional here in establishing Lenin's cult of personality, which later is going to be useful as well for Stalin. Hilariously, the testament doesn't look good for Stalin. The testament laid out what government should achieve when he died, but not who should get power. Essentially, the entire testament was arguing why Stalin was scary and power-hungry and should never be trusted. Many people in the Politburo were also listed in this document as being bad for the Communist Party, and so they weren't really eager to publish the article after Lenin's death, and instead, Trotsky gets to be seen as the biggest threat to the USSR because he's the one that pinned the document in the first place. In order to isolate Trotsky, Stalin works with two trusted party officials named Kamenev and Zinoviev to start a fake news campaign, discrediting Trotsky, along with the USSR, and it's filled with the usual. Trotsky's Jewish, never heard that one before, and he's not a good original member, even though we saw him in the prior picture. It's fine. Stalin revokes Trotsky's index card, which again is hilarious, which is essentially his communist members union card. If you're not a party member, then you can't legally hold office. Obviously, that seems really tame, especially for Stalin, kicking him out of the club. We're going to stop there. Don't worry, he shows his true colors soon. With Trotsky discredited and out of the Communist Party, Stalin writes a touching eulogy for Lenin, using Lenin's death as propaganda in his favor. Stalin then rewards loyal friends to positions of powers directly underneath him so that he ensures unquestionable loyalty during this time of transition. Communism is built off of a permanent revolution. The proletariat must be uncomfortable and in a constant state of revolution to ensure change over time. Stalin uses Trotsky's discredited existence to create a revolution that will allow his takeover. He identifies the people who align with Trotsky as leftists. They want to abandon the new economic policies of Lenin's era, where they are allowed some market economy to exist. Trotsky believed, as did Lenin, that a true communist state cannot allow this market economy to exist long term, and that they're eventually going to have to bite that bullet and accept some losses to emerge into a new communist perfection. On the other hand are the rightists. Now, I remember thinking, Stalin is always right. Scary people are always right. And for the interim, it would be necessary to industrialize Russia using the manpower of the peasants to demonstrate how strong their economy had grown. You couldn't just revoke the new economic policy. You needed to grow the economy and take small changes over time. Consolidate the revolution, thereby making sure USSR would survive, and then worry about exporting communism outside of Russia. So in the meantime, Stalin wants communism in one country. So the Politburo votes in 1925, and Trotsky is forced to leave his position officially. Once Stalin wins, his allies, Molotov and Kirov, take positions in the Politburo to replace Trotsky and his followers. Molotov is the major signer of the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which we'll cover later. He's also the person who is known as the creator of the Molotov cocktail. We'll get there as well. Once the rightists win against the leftists, Stalin then turns to discredit the people who helped him gain power, similar to the Night of Long Knives and Hitler, and removes Kamenev and Zinoviev, who will later die in the purges. What you need to remember is that the rightists and the leftists only lasted long enough for Stalin to remove Trotsky. After that, it's Stalinism, and his policies, which began rightist, are going to shift back to leftist. He's eventually going to agree with Trotsky. Stalin's like the wind. He blows with the moods. All right, Stalin moves to an economic reform model, losing my mustache, of collectivization and state procurements, just like Trotsky had. And people are too afraid to challenge him. He begins setting quotas for production and capturing properties, which leads the USSR towards the brink of economic collapse and potentially another civil war. So he's clearly crazy and feared by most. Has an amazing mustache, though. I mean, look, I think mine needs to be a little more full. If I go like this, it looks better. I'm going to do it like this for now. How does he consolidate his power in this ever-changing state? Well, by limiting access to information and causing a fractured society. He convinced citizens that they were under threat of a fascist or American invasion at any moment. And this is believable to many because the Russian Civil War was not that long ago. People that refused to drink his fear Kool-Aid were subsequently killed. And therefore, when he asked if everyone was okay with him becoming the uncontested supreme leader of Russia, surprisingly, no one argued. All right, from here, we're going to look at the social and economic policies of Stalinism and how he continued to rid his country of opposition, which allowed for his maintenance of power from 1925 to 1953 when he dies in a pool of his own urine due to a stroke and his family's fear to check on him as he died a long and painful death.